Good morning. Hello there. Today, I'm going to be talking about the developmental aspects that you need to think about when you're working with children and adolescents and families and using play therapy and expressive arts. So first, full disclosure, one of my dogs is being crazy pants this morning. So she is a knucklehead. You may hear her barking. You may hear her digging. She's right now panting very loudly in my office here. So if you hear strange noises behind me, or that is my crazy dog, Lily. So anyways, so today I want to talk about the developmental aspects when you're working with children, adolescents, and families, and how that looks, so to speak, in the treatment process. So last week, I gave more of an overview of things that you need to think about in your clinical decision-making process. And for the next couple of weeks, next 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks, I think, I really want to go into a little bit more of a deeper dive and give some clinical examples just to highlight some things that you want to think about. So I'm going to be using fictitious clients. This is based on like almost 30 years of working with children and adolescents. So there may be some things that look like they're for maybe a client you're working with, or maybe somebody that you know. These are fictitious clients. So there are a lot of similarities across the board. So that's why I thought maybe using kind of clinical examples might help to stimulate thoughts about what you need to be looking for, decisions that you may want to consider when you're thinking about decisions for interventions and pacing of treatment, who to include in the treatment process, maybe what may be going on underneath those things. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm Kathy Spooner. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and registered play therapist supervisor with almost 30 years experience working with children, adolescents, and families. And actually, prior to getting my master's in social work, I was a special education teacher. I taught children with emotional problems, and they typically also had learning problems as well. So I taught children in 3rd and 4th grade in a self-contained classroom. This was back in the 80s, so it's been a while. I think what was helpful for me about that was really getting to understand developmental aspects to think about with children, as well as maybe some underlying learning challenges that haven't been identified, and how those learning challenges and emotional problems may show up with the kids. So how emotional difficulties can really impair and delay education and cause problems academically. But also how in the therapy treatment process, I think we're working with children and adolescents, so we have an opportunity to identify possible learning challenges or something else, maybe neurobiologically or developmentally, that may be going on that would warrant further, more in-depth psychological testing, neuropsychological testing, occupational evaluation, something that may just further assessment to get a more clear picture of what's going on with their clients. So that's why I think it's really important to think about those things. And as a former special educator, I think that gave me a really good opportunity or experience to think about those things and see how those may manifest with children as well. So I love using play therapy and expressive arts, especially because I have always, my goal has always been to work with children and adolescents and families. So I think this is a really powerful modality to use when working with children. So if you're joining me today, go ahead and post your name and your where you're from, what population you work with. Go ahead and post that in the comments, and let's see who's here today. Okay, so last week, as I said, I gave an overview of clinical decision making, what it is, some things that you need to think about in your clinical decision making. And this week, in the next few weeks, I wanted to take a deeper dive into what that may actually look like when you are working with children and adolescents in the treatment process. So this week, I want to take a deeper look at developmental needs of treatment, developmental things to look for in the treatment process. So that's what we're going to focus on today. The thing is, you want to think about how developmentally we think about chronological and social emotional. They're not always the same. So what I'm going to do is I am going to share my screen with you. Take my notes, put them over here. I think I'm getting better at sharing my screen. If you're watching while I'm doing this, go ahead and post your name in the comments. Let's see who's here. I am going to share my screen. All right. There we go. I hope that works. Does that work? Yes, I think that's working. There we go. Okay. This should be it. All right. So things to be thinking about when you are making decisions today. We want to think about the developmental aspects of the treatment process when you're working with children and adolescents. So what are the factors to consider for the developmental needs of children and adolescents in treatment? And how might you see those developmental things show up in the treatment process? And one of the things we want to think about is the age of the child. So we have chronological age, and we also have social emotional age, and those are not always the same. So you want to think about maybe a child showing up in your office, maybe 7 years old, socially and emotionally. What you may see, and this is what you want to make sure you're looking at, maybe that child is more socially emotionally 5-year-old. So what does that mean when you're thinking about the developmental level and the clinical decision-making process? What are some things that you want to look for to help you recognize some of those possible developmental delays or delayed social emotional development where they are? Maybe some learning challenges. So some of the things that you want to look for the child's ability to articulate themselves. Is that kind of on par? Maybe they're not very articulate. Maybe they're more of an introverted personality style, and they tend to not verbalize themselves as well as maybe a child who's more of a extroverted personality. Or maybe you have a child who's super duper anxious and they're an introverted personality. And so for them, talking with somebody they don't know very well, that's going to be even more challenging for them. Or maybe you have a child who's 7 and they can articulate themselves extremely well, maybe above what a 7-year-old might be able to do. So you may be looking at a child who's much more bright, possibly even gifted. And anytime you're looking at children who are gifted, you're looking at what we call an asynchronous development, meaning chronologically, they may be 7, 8, maybe cognitively and maybe in their cognitive abilities with math, so to speak, maybe they're more like a 10-year-old. So their ability to conceptualize and their cognitive abilities to process and understand and put things together is at a much higher level than somebody their age, which means cognitively they're much more advanced than their peers. Socially, emotionally, though, they're still 7 or 8 years old. And how are they managing that discrepancy of being a little more advanced in one area and yet other area they're still having to figure things out? So the other thing you want to look at developmentally is what's their ability to access and articulate their thoughts, their memories, their emotions. You want to think about their emotion vocabulary and their ability to recognize their own emotions. Children are going to have a harder time doing that when they get into adolescence. They should have a better ability to do that, although that's part of the treatment process, I think, is helping our clients to be able to do that. So the other thing is we want to look at their ability to tolerate emotional distress and emotion regulation, thinking about their neural development. A younger child, like a 3 or 4-year-old, their ability to regulate their emotions based on their age is going to look much different than a 10 or 11-year-old, because we're still, I call it, laying down those neural circuitry for emotion regulation. So a much younger child is going to most definitely need the adults in their lives to help co-regulate those strong emotions. And then by the time they get into middle school and high school, they ideally have a better ability to internally regulate. I think as human beings, we always need people to kind of help us when we're stressed and going through really challenging times. But these are the things what we want to look at, because if you have, let's say, a 12-year-old who's emotionally dysregulating a lot, then that gives you an idea of where they are developmentally with some of that social-emotional development. And then we want to look at what's the reason for that, what's going on with that. The other thing we look at is their ability to make decisions and their problem solving. You can see that in the playroom, most definitely. So we're looking at their ability to tolerate distress while making decisions or solving problems. We want to look at their ability to solve problems and make decisions. Do they ask for help a lot? Is there a lot of learned helplessness? Do they struggle with figuring out how things work? And then the other thing, I think as child and adolescent therapists, we have a really good opportunity to recognize when there may be potential learning problems, or because if we notice that they're really, really struggling in school, for instance, let's say a 6-year-old who hates school, hates school, and the any homework sent home, they're avoidant, or there's lots of meltdowns around school, and they don't want to go to school, and they get in trouble a lot at school. 6-year-olds typically still like school there. It's still pretty new. They like all the challenges and that kind of budding independence. So that's much different than if you get like a middle schooler who, they're tired of school. They only go to school maybe for the friendships. They might like school, but, and they get their work done. These are things that I think it's important, because if you get a 5 or a 6-year-old and they hate school already, the likelihood you're looking at some kind of underlying learning or processing, or maybe attention or developmental delay, is pretty high at that point. So you want to keep those things in mind and think about those things. The other thing you want to think about are their peer relationships. Are they able to make friends? Are they able to keep friends? Are they bossy? Are they not bossy? Are they aggressive? Do they understand the give and take of friendships? Do they pick up on the social nuances of social interactions? Do they get picked on or bullied a lot? Those are all really important things when you're doing your case conceptualization and gathering all that information. You want to ask about these things. And then throughout the treatment process, we're looking at these things to continue to gather more information throughout the treatment process to give us an idea of what may be going on with our client. And then we kind of adjust how we address things, our interventions, who we involve in the treatment process. So those are all things that we want to keep in mind. Just some of the highlights, I think, of what to look for. So when we're choosing a play therapy or expressive arts modality, we want to think about those developmental needs. What play therapy or expressive arts modality may work more effectively with the developmental needs of the child that you're working with? And there are a couple that I typically think about. So I've been trained to use child-centered play therapy. So that's one of the tools in my toolbox that I use. And I think about the children in my on my caseload who I think about their developmental stages and what play therapy, expressive arts modality may work more effectively with that child. And child-centered play therapy is one of the ones that I think about. The other is using like prescriptive play therapy, which is kind of an integrated approach, using more directive interventions with kids and adolescents and families, using expressive arts. If I'm using expressive arts, what theoretical model am I going to use with that? So when you're looking at development, looking at the tools in your toolbox that you have, which one of those will meet the developmental needs of that child? So the way that works for me is if I'm working with a younger child, so I'll work with children ages 3 and up. If I'm working with a child who's most definitely a 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, 7-year-old, I'm most definitely going to be using child-centered play therapy because I think developmentally that meets their needs more effectively based on all of the tools in my toolbox and the ways in which I've been trained. If I'm working with an 8-year-old, I'm going to be, to me, from my experience, they're kind of in that transition point that an 8-year-old, depending on developmentally how they are, maybe socially, emotionally, they may be 5 or 6, but maybe developmentally, chronologically, they're 8, then child-centered play therapy is most likely going to be a more effective way to get started with them because a 5 or 6 social emotional age, that's to me, the perfect target range for child-centered play therapy. If I'm working with an 8-year-old who's pretty socially, emotionally savvy and pretty articulate for an 8-year-old, the likelihood I'm going to use more of an integrated approach with some directive activities to teach skills, teach emotion vocabulary, and those kinds of things is pretty high. Once they get into adolescence and especially high school, I'm pretty much predominantly just using expressive arts like art and centre, maybe poetry. We may look at some integrate some music in the process. For middle school, so middle school is a big transitional time. So middle school, I think it's pretty, most of us understand at this point, girls typically socially, emotionally are on average, a little more advanced than boys in middle school, socially, emotionally. So it's been my experience for boys in middle school, um, socially, emotionally, the directive play therapy interventions are still pretty good because they're more active. Overall, not always, but overall, I find in the middle school age, they do really well if I still use some of the more active play therapy directive approaches with them. I do use expressive arts as well. I just typically need to have a little more action in there than being sedentary. So that's a general statement. And again, you have to think about the needs of your clients. So you most definitely want to look at those because sometimes girls do much, much better with more of the active interventions. And I do use active interventions with the girls. And these are all the things that I think about in the decision-making process. So some of the things that you want to, when you're doing your case conceptualization, you're thinking about, is this child who's presenting with emotion dysregulation? So today we're going to focus on looking at clinical case examples for clients who are presenting to your office with emotion dysregulation. Most of us have quite a few of those on our caseloads. So if we're thinking about some of those underlying factors that are contributing to emotion dysregulation in our case conceptualization, some of the things that we want to look for and kind of assess and get a sense of is, are we looking at possible ADHD? And there's predominantly hyperactive, combined type, and inattentive type. Inattentive type, from my experience, takes a little longer oftentimes to recognize because they're usually not getting in trouble in school. The predominantly hyperactive kids are pretty much, I think most of us, general population tends to think of ADHD, looks and kind of presents more like a child with predominantly hyperactive. I call it big H, little h, and no H. The big H kids get identified pretty quickly because they're constantly on the go. There's a lot of kind of hallmarks. And emotion dysregulation can be one of those presenting symptoms with ADHD. It's an executive function components to it. So are we looking at autism spectrum? Are we looking at a child with sensory processing dysfunction? If I have a child who presents to my office and they've got a ton of anxiety and their parents are well functioning, they pick up on their child's needs pretty well, there's not like an excessive amount of anxiety in their home environment, meaning, everybody deals with stressors and overall those get managed pretty well and parents are able to read and address the needs of their child, then the picture doesn't quite fit, so to speak, for a child who's extremely anxious and a fairly well-functioning home environment, so it doesn't necessarily make sense. One of the things that I'll start to do is I'll start asking some questions about sensory processing, and they're including in there how emotionally sensitive that child is. Because emotionally, we pick up, some kids are really, really emotionally sensitive, and they pick up on everybody's emotions, and they worry about everybody because they're picking up on everybody's emotions. So those are things to keep in mind as well to look for. Are they presenting with anxiety, depression, attachment issues, trauma, grief and loss? Any of those presenting issues, you're looking at the possibility of emotion dysregulation associated with those. So these are all the things that we think about when we're conceptualizing what's going on and what we're looking for, and when we're gathering all the information with our psychosocial assessment. All right, so let's get into a case conceptualization. A case example. So this is, I love this picture. I don't know why I love this picture. I just love this picture. Anyways, maybe because I work with these kids and I know what challenges they can be for their parents and teachers, and they're usually like, they've got so many good qualities, but the emotion dysregulation just kind of overwhelms everybody. All right, so meet Sam. He's a fictitious 6-year-old client, and his presenting problem is emotion regulation. So in gathering the information about Sam from his parents, I find that Sam is constantly on the go. As a baby, he met developmental milestones for walking and talking early. As a toddler, he seemed to need attention a lot and didn't tolerate any parental limits. He'd have meltdowns. In preschool, he was constantly on the go. He was kind of physically aggressive to other kids. If he wanted something, he kind of pushed them out of the way. And he didn't have the ability to tolerate being still or waiting his turn. He was also really bossy and controlling in his social interactions. They had to do it his way. He loved recess, loved running around. He was kind of a little maniac at recess, very, very active, and gets into elementary school. The teacher has to keep him close to her desk because he's constantly off task. He's like poking the kid next to him or talking, or he'll raise his hand and he blurts things out before he's called on. He rushes to the head of the line and pushes the kid at the front of the line because he wants to be first. So he's going to be first. He gets really easily irritated. And his parents report this is really, so he has a really hard time with school. He doesn't like going to school. Homework time is lots of meltdowns. Parents have a hard time getting to sit down and do the homework. He'll rush through his work. He makes tons of mistakes. He hates writing. He's really good at math, though. And if you ask him questions, or if you give him like math problems as a 6-year-old, he's able to do math of maybe like a 9-year-old level, 3rd grade, 4th grade even. So in math, he's really advanced, but he doesn't like doing the work. And parents report what's confusing to them is when he plays video games, he has no problem sustaining attention. He's on task, and he can get it done. So this is Sam. And so he comes to the office, and developmentally, he's 6. He's got a ton of emotion regulation problems. He's starting to hate school. He's constantly on the go. One of the things I'm going to conceptualize here, and parents they try the traditional parenting where they set limits, they give him choices. He constantly is having meltdowns at home if any limits are set. They ask him to go do something. He doesn't remember. He forgets. Then he lies about it, which upsets parents because now their child is lying. But they've tried all of the traditional kind of parenting. Nobody wants them to come over because he's the kid that drives everybody crazy. So at the age of 6, he's got a bad reputation already. So with that clinical presentation at that age, I'm thinking, well, he doesn't like school at 6 years old. He should like school. He's higher cognitively in one area, and yet school for him is torturous. He's got a lot of impulse control, having a hard time sustaining attention. He can't remember. If you give him directions for more than one thing or 2 things at the most, he cannot remember them. And that his way of coping with it is lying about it. So for this presentation, I'm thinking I'm going to most definitely, because of his age, I'm going to start with child-centered play therapy, and I'm going to see how he interacts in the playroom with me. With this kind of a presentation, child-centered play therapy typically works wonders. I typically don't have any oppositional type of behavior showing up, because the likelihood Sam got diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder is very high. The thing is with ODD, there's usually something underneath of it. So I'm always trying to figure out, all right, he's manifesting with ODD. 6-year-olds do not typically, on a developmental level, they typically do not like making grown-ups mad at them or not having any friends. So, and they typically don't hate school at this point because he's in first grade. They don't typically hate first grade. So I'm going to be wondering what's going on, and I'll probably do a little bit more assessment. Most likely, I will highly recommend more psychological testing. I'll probably also ask questions to see if there might be a sensory processing issue going on that may need a referral to an occupational therapist who can assess maybe some sensory processing things going on. In the treatment process, though, my decision-making will be, because he's 6, I'm going to use child-centered play therapy. And in there, I'm going to be watching for how active he is. Does he tend to be able to sustain play for a very long time? Or is he constantly shifting in his play and he doesn't stay in one play activity for very long? I'm going to be looking for, I always look for also how kids manage whether or not they have to clean up, which most of them love the fact that they don't have to clean up for child-centered play therapy. But if by the end of the session, if my client has gone through and used all of my toys and all of my toys are on the floor, then I'm looking at most likely a child who is struggling to sustain attention, and their activity level, it exceeds their ability to regulate themselves. So I'm most definitely going to want to refer some psychological testing. In the treatment process, part of my decision-making is I want this child to be able to engage in the play process. So even though directing in the child-centered play therapy model is not part of the model, what we can do is set limits. And the limits are around protecting the relationship with the therapist. And also, does it meet the needs of the child? Like, they need the limit setting. So for some kids who have presented like this in the treatment process, it doesn't happen very often. But what I've done in my clinical decision making is I've set limits around how many toys they can actually play with. And it's like toy category. So if they're playing in the kitchen area, I may say, well, you can only play with 4 different kinds of toys during the treatment process. And what I'm helping them do is I want to help them to maybe sustain attention a little bit longer in the play activity, to help kind of co-regulate them in the play therapy session. Most of the time, I don't have to do that. On occasion, I do need to do that. And if I have a child who, most of the time, most kids will probably put some things back. On occasion, you'll get a child who doesn't put anything back, and your playroom's wrecked. So you probably have to make some clinical decisions around, maybe I make sure the next client after that client is somebody that I don't need to be in the playroom with, so that I have time to clean the playroom up. Or I may have to do a really quick cleanup in between sessions in order to get some of those things put away, because my client needs to work through that process. If my client really needs me to co-regulate, then I'll make clinical decisions around what that may look like. And one of the things that we do in my supervision group, so I have an online play therapy supervision group. We meet twice a month. And one of the things that we'll do is we'll look at all of those things for their client and think about what needs to happen for that client and who needs to be involved. How are we going to integrate the parents? Okay, so my second one. This is Tommy. He's a fictitious 9-year-old client. He's also presenting with emotion regulation problems. So Tommy, his biological parents had drug and alcohol problems, so he was removed from their care by Child Protective Services at the age of 2 and placed in foster care at the age of 2. And during the time he was living with his biological parents who had drug and alcohol problems, he also experienced a lot of neglect and some physical abuse. So when he was placed in foster care, he had a lot of emotional dysregulations, a lot of emotional meltdowns, behavioral outbursts, some physical aggression. So he had a hard time. He was in 2 foster homes because the foster parents were not able to handle that. So at the age of 4, he was placed in a foster to adopt home at the age of 4 years old, in which for the first 4 years of his life, he did not have very good experiences with co-regulation. He wasn't able to use the adults in his life for co-regulation. Safety and security was problematic. So from an attachment standpoint, we're looking at some attachment issues here. We're looking at some trauma issues here, and his ability to trust and regulate his emotions based on experiencing a lot of threat. His neurocircuitry is assessing threat on a regular basis. The problem is with trauma and attachment, wounding, there may not necessarily be threat, but he's going to be acting as if there is threat. So he struggled with a lot of emotional outbursts, an inability to use foster parents to help him regulate his emotions, a lot of food hoarding. They would find food wrappers under his bed. They're always talking to him about not leaving food in his room because it would get ants and bugs, but he would do it anyway. He would steal food, even though they would offer to have food at different points in time. So food hoarding was a really big thing for him. And when he started kindergarten at the age of 5, he struggled with a lot of high energy, inability to sustain attention, a lot of moving around, a lot of outbursts. For a child who's experienced trauma and attachment issues, the ability to feel safe and secure, they're constantly on hyper alert. So their academic success can be problematic as well because they can't settle into sustaining attention because their neurocircuitry is constantly on high alert for danger. So here we see emotion dysregulation for Tommy is most likely rooted in his trauma and attachment. So for him at 9, I'm most likely going to use more of a trauma-informed play therapy approach with him, in which I want to establish safety and security with him first. So I will most likely start out using child-centered play therapy to establish relationship, to establish a sense of safety and security, because he's going to be able to basically call the shots and I'll be following him. At 9 years old with child-centered play therapy, sometimes the kids get really irritated with the tracking. So I want to make sure that I'm kind of reading his cues about the tracking, and I might have to really cut back on that or not use that modality, because if they're constantly getting irritated by the child-centered tracking, then we're going to have a hard time establishing a therapeutic rapport and safety in the in the playroom. So what I'll probably do is start out with some really non-confrontational or challenging, really low challenging play therapy activities. I probably am going to want to explore his ability to identify emotion. So I may teach him an emotion vocabulary. I may kind of do some play therapy interventions, that all directive, in which I assess his ability to maybe read social cues. There's a couple of games that I have about that. And then I may probably want to teach him some coping skills early on to help him begin regulating. And then from there, I'm probably going to do some interventions that are going to explore his experiences of trauma, of relationships, what's a safe place for him, really kind of how does he see the world. And then begin identifying maybe some of his cognitive distortions and exploring those, and do some of that reworking and rewriting his narrative. The likelihood I'm going to involve his foster parents in the treatment process to do some attachment related activities with them is very high, because I really want to work on helping him to trust his foster parents, to use them to co-regulate and help his foster parents understand the behavior and teach them some skills for helping to co-regulate him. So 2 different presentations for emotion regulation, and based on the case conceptualization, we're looking at different things. So again, here are some of the things that we think about for emotion regulation. For Tommy, we're looking at attachment issues and trauma, most definitely for him. We also want to make sure we're looking at any other kind of potential delays for him, learning challenges, sensory processing, things like that as well. And so for Tommy, I used more of a prescriptive approach based on his chronological age, integrating directive play therapy and expressive arts for skill building. And then I'm going to kind of, the prescriptive approach will give me some directive tools that will help me to accommodate some of those underlying issues that he's struggling with. So that would be all part of my clinical decision making for him. So just as a wrap up, some of the things that you want to keep in mind for your clinical decision making regarding the developmental levels are, you want to think about chronological age versus social emotional age. You want to think about what play therapy and or expressive arts modality is going to best meet the developmental need of your client. And then also, you also want to make sure you're thinking about what modalities you're trained to use and what ages are those, will those modalities work with, so that you can meet those developmental needs. And then the final thing that I didn't put on here, the playroom, the treatment process is also another opportunity to get a sense of, are there any underlying issues for like ADHD or autism spectrum, sensory processing, learning problems that may need further assessment. So you may need to refer out to find out what other things might be going on with your client, to make sure that you're helping them to get you're identifying all those different roots, so to speak, of where that behavior is coming from. All right, so I am going to stop sharing my screen. There we go. All right. So that is it for today. If you have, in the comments, post some of your things that you think about when you're doing clinical decision making with children and adolescents. What's one of the things that has been the biggest challenge for you in your clinical decision-making process, especially the developmental aspects of play therapy? So, and maybe some of the things that you've learned to look for to help you identify what might be going on with your client and you think about for your clinical decision making. So just if you're interested, I have an online supervision group for mental health professionals using play therapy and expressive arts. We do a lot of the clinical decision making in that. We look at the developmental aspects, cognitive aspects, family. We look at the child in context. We come up with interventions to use, different modalities, make sure that those are being applied in a way that's most ethical and most effective. So we do a lot of sharing of those ideas and a lot of exploration. It's nice in a group modality because you learn from others as well. If you're interested in the online group, I have one, maybe two more spots available in that group. So you can contact me, just private message me or post something in the comments here, and I'd be happy to schedule a time to talk with you to make sure the group is a good fit for you. And that is it for today, and I will see you next time. Bye.